Programming on DUTV is made possible by the Cal and Lucille Rudman Institute for Entertainment Studies and the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for coming out on a rainy evening. Welcome to the National Constitution Center. I'm Allison Young. I'm the Vice President of Public Engagement here, and we're really glad that you've joined us this evening for what will be a timely and thought-provoking discussion, and we're proud to partner with Temple University and Drexel University to bring you this program this evening on the rise of a digital democracy. For the courtesy of our guests for this evening's program, flash photography is not permitted, and we ask that you please take a moment now to put your cell phones on silence. Thank you. We're glad that you've joined us here tonight, just steps from where our founding fathers came together to create our Constitution and establish our own democracy over 200 years ago. As we begin our discussion on the role of social media in emerging democratic movements worldwide, we rightfully remember those founders who crafted a constitution that honors and welcomes the many voices of we, the people. And in 2011, those voices come not only from our audience joining us here at the National Constitution Center, but also online via our live webcast. Since we're talking about the role of social media as an accelerant in democratic movements worldwide, throughout the program, we'll also be taking questions via Facebook and Twitter, as well as from our live audience. If anyone has a smartphone or laptop that's in silent mode and wants to submit questions for our panel electronically, they can do so using the Twitter hashtag #DigitalDemocracy. In a moment, you'll meet our distinguished panel of guests, but first, I would like to recognize and welcome Cal and Lucille Rudman, if you could please stand, whose foundation has provided generous support of Drexel, Temple, and other universities. Thank you. The support of the Rudman Foundation has helped thousands of students and has made tonight's event possible. Also, a special thanks to Alan Sabinson, Dean of Drexel's Westphal College, and Thomas Jacobson, who's with us tonight, Interim Dean of Temple's School of Communications and Theater. And I'd also like to thank the Board of Trustees of the National Constitution Center. Following tonight's event, we invite you to continue the conversation online via the National Constitution Center's blog at blog.constitutioncenter.org and via our Facebook page. And please encourage your friends who couldn't join us in person tonight to watch this event on TUTV, Temple's television station, and DUTV, Drexel's television station, starting Friday, April 22nd. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Jennifer Preston. Jennifer is currently a staff writer at the New York Times, where she covers the intersection of social media with politics, government, business, and real life. She took on this role in January of this year after working as the newsroom's first social media editor, a position that entailed helping fellow journalists utilize social media for reporting, real-time publishing, and building community. A veteran reporter and editor, Jennifer began her career right here in Philadelphia at the Bulletin newspaper and at the Philadelphia Daily News. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Preston and our distinguished panel.
Thank you, Allison. And it's great to be here at the National Constitution Center, and because we're going to be talking about social media, we're looking for all of you to join the conversation. But first, what I'd like to do is introduce you to our terrific panel tonight to get that conversation going, because we're going to talk about the role of Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Al Jazeera, cell phone cameras, and the very important role that it played in helping fuel the unrest that has spread from North Africa to the Middle East. But of course, we all know that what made the tremendous change taking place across the Middle East happen are the people on the ground. And Charlie Sennett, who was right there in Egypt on the ground when all of that happened, can tell us a little bit about that. And Nadine, who is with us from Cairo on Skype. But first, what I'd like to do is introduce you, please, to Tony Berman, who is the head of strategy for Al Jazeera, here based in Washington, D.C. And Tony joined Al Jazeera 3 years ago after a long and distinguished career at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, where he was the executive editor and executive director. Charles Sennett, who's an old friend of mine, we were reporters together just a few years ago in New York City, covering the cop shop, is now the executive editor and co-founder of Global Post, which is an online journalism site that is dedicated to international news. Charlie helped start this online news organization after serving many years as a foreign correspondent for the Boston Globe. He was the Middle East bureau chief based in Jerusalem for the Boston Globe, and also worked out of London for many years for the Boston Globe before starting Global Post. And many of you may have seen it. Charlie was involved in this terrific documentary called Revolution in Cairo that was broadcast recently, and that you worked together with the folks on Frontline. It was broadcast on PBS. Susanna Vila is the content and outreach director for movements.org, which is this nonprofit organization that began a couple of years ago that helps train young people and activists, human rights activists all over the world, in how to be smart about using digital tools. And one of the wonderful things about movements.org is they help other activists train other activists. And so, so Susanna will be telling us a little bit about that work, about her work and the very important role that that has played. And with us, Nadine, can you hear us here? Fabulous. With us, joining us from Cairo via Skype, is Nadine Wahab, who is currently a deputy campaign manager for Mohammed el-Baradei's presidential bid in Egypt. And during the Egyptian uprising, and in the many months that led up to the Egyptian uprising, Nadine was one of the admins of the We Are All Khalid Said Facebook page. And this was the Facebook page that was started in June of last year, following the death of a 28-year-old Egyptian man who was killed by police in Cairo. So Nadine will tell us about that, because one thing that is very important for folks to understand is it's not as if someone created an event on January 15th and said, hey, on January 25th, let's show up, you know, in Cairo and for Police Day and protest. The role that Facebook played took place many months, took place many years, which Susanna can tell us about, with the April 6th youth movement starting back in 2008. So to get the conversation started, what we'd like to do here is take a look from this tape that we have from CBS, from the CBS Evening News on February 11th.
A new day in an ancient land. A people's revolution topples the president of Egypt.
Mohammed Hosni Mubarak had decided to step down.
After 18 days of protests, an eruption of euphoria.
People are literally dancing in the street.
For now, the military's in charge, but the U.S. calls for free and fair elections.
But this is not the end of Egypt's transition. It's a beginning.
Tonight, Egypt, the road ahead.
Thank you. So we'll start with Nadine. Nadine, the We Are All Khalid Said Facebook page was so influential in the events in Egypt. So can you tell us how that page came about? And we have some video of a flash mob demonstration that took place in June of 2010. And I'd like you to take us back there as we roll the tape.
So Well, Khaled Said died at the hands of police. He had caught some video of them, was pulled out from a cyber cafe, and was beaten to death. This isn't a unique moment in Egyptian history, but what happened is the picture of his brutal beating was leaked to the internet and sort of created an uproar. Wael decided to create a page, and I had worked with him prior to that. He then told me about the page, and we all got really excited about it and started working. One of the main ideas behind the page was how to engage people, not just on Facebook, because you have people getting on, liking stuff, commenting, but how to move that offline. And the flash mob was our first attempt at that. And I have to give all the credit to Wael. It was an idea that came up on the page. He took it forward. And it was one of these things that was a stroke of serendipity, genius, you don't know what to call it. And I can't quite see what's viewing, but what you should be seeing is people lined up. And this is on the Corniche or the boardwalk in Alexandria, dressed in black. Now, to understand the basis of this, the Egyptian emergency law doesn't allow you to gather in a crowd of more than 5, and you have to be a certain space apart. So the whole idea behind this was to give people a sense of security. So you weren't supposed to engage with the person. You weren't actually breaking the law. You were staying within the confines of the law, but still voicing a dissenting voice. So this engaged the people who weren't really protesters, who weren't the cult of the protest in Egypt, where there was about, I would say, 200 of them. So you had mothers, women, families coming out and lining up on the Corniche, dressed in black. And it was, viewing it from abroad, it was quite wonderful, seeing all these people over a number of weeks coming out. One of the other aspects of this was the online involvement, was you had people taking pictures, posting them online, taking videos, posting it online, and then this is the idea of crowdsourcing. But it wasn't necessarily something that we thought of in advance, but since Facebook had created the space for people to speak out and to engage in this, they started creating videos as the one you saw, creating pictures, and this sort of started this very activist, very active space for people to express their dissent and express their creativity in a way that was, in a sense, a form of protest in itself.
Yeah, because people created YouTube videos, and then when police were lying to Khaled Said's mother about what the cause of death was, there were cell phone photos and that were posted on that Facebook page, and as well as interviews with local shopkeepers and witnesses who said that they did in fact see police beat him. So how many members did that page have in mid-January?
I think it was 600. We're now at 1 million. It really jumped when it got announced that Wael had been caught and then was released from the Amn al-Dawla, the security service. So I think it jumped quite a bit, but I think around the January 25th revolution, it was at 600,000.
So that's quite a lot of people to get the word out.
And so, in Facebook, you sort of, it's the magnification of it, because people post to their friends. So it's not just the people who are actively following Facebook. And Khaled Said was an amazing thing, because people would comment. I mean, it wasn't abnormal to have 2,000-3,000 comments. At the height that I saw, you had 30,000 comments on one post. People were arguing, and the process was you were engaging in a conversation. And what's interesting is, because this is a conversation that wasn't allowed on the real space in Egypt. So the organic conversation that was happening, or that would happen in a normal space, maybe in the United States or Europe, was happening online. People were debating this. And this was a process. I mean, from June last year to this year, there was a process where we were talking about an issue where everyone can sort of agree that, the police beating a middle-class someone that everyone could empathize with, young man, young entrepreneur, to you moved into, there were several steps to it, where the last election, you moved into a very political discourse. But I mean, the admins that were posting, I was kind of a firewall, but I paid attention very closely to it. The admins that were posting were very aware of their market, and it was, from my perspective, it was another form of organizing. It was just organizing in a different space. You're aware of your audience, you're aware of who you're talking to, and you engage them in a conversation at that level, and then move them past that. So at the elections last November, we had a parliamentary elections that was, it was corrupt, it was not free and fair, and so you saw that. You see people posting videos of ballot boxes being stuffed. You saw this sort of influx and this really, the transfer of a non-political voice on Facebook to extremely political voice. And I think that also led to the January 25th, where Tunis allowed them to believe that they could speak out not only on Facebook, but in real life. And that is what led to the January 25th movement.
Okay, thank you. Al Jazeera, as everyone knows, has played a major, major role. So, Tony, maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. And what we'd like to do is take a look at the tape that Al Jazeera, some clips here.
Tunisian unrest makes waves in Lausanne.
Demo tomorrow outside the Tunisian embassy in London.
A flash mob is planned in Berlin on Saturday.
There are no reporters in Tunisia to tell us what's really happening.
About this sooner. Mass media has totally failed.
Terrorism equals lots of media coverage. Democratic revolution equals little media coverage.
The Tunisian government has decided it wants to restrict the freedoms of their own people. In doing so, the Tunisian government has made itself an enemy of Anonymous.
The internet is reportedly cut off from Sidi Bouzid.
People are creating barricades to protect their neighbors.
Students demonstrating in Klabia, 50 miles.
Injured young man shot by police in his back in Kafsa.
We are concerned by the shutdown of Al Jazeera in Egypt and the arrest of its correspondents. Egypt must be open and the reporters released.
So, Tony, it might be helpful for the audience to bring us back to Tunisia, because Al Jazeera played a major role there. The unrest, it began in the middle of December when a fruit vendor in his 20s, just frustrated and angry with the bureaucracy there, had his final humiliation over a dispute with the police officer, set himself afire, which set off protests in this town and then across the country, which was, again, shared and reported on Facebook. And tell us about the role of Al Jazeera there.
Well, I mean, a bit of context is that I think, particularly in the United States, Al Jazeera, the whole notion of Al Jazeera reminds people of tensions with the U.S. government, particularly the previous one, various controversies within the West. But in reality, the most dominant relationship with Al Jazeera since its creation, the Arabic Service in 1996, has been its tensions with dictatorial, authoritarian Arab governments. I mean, there's probably, I can't think of any Arab country where Al Jazeera has not at one point been thrown out of. And the tensions between Al Jazeera and Tunisia, the Tunisian government, the previous Tunisian government, the previous Egyptian government were incredible. Our journalists were harassed. Our journalists were prevented from reporting in the open. So to a certain extent, I think what evolved through the events of Tunisia, which, as you point out, began in mid-December and through Egypt and beyond, and Libya and Yemen, was a kind of a partnership, an unpredicted partnership between social media, new media, and traditional media. And I think the case of this one fruit vendor who killed himself, and pictures of that were on Facebook and were picked up on YouTube, and we're picked up by Al Jazeera, and then we're broadcast not only throughout Tunisia but throughout the Arab world as part of the normal Al Jazeera coverage. And I think a lot of Arabs in the Middle East, I mean, expected that of Jazeera, because I think that clearly Al Jazeera embodies the values that many of these authoritarian governments despise. So I think what happened through the events of Tunisia and clearly through Egypt is that it really became a loop. Our reporters were almost on the run. They rarely were able to report and identify themselves. But we were determined, and the network was determined, that this Arab awakening, which was so long in coming, I think would be broadcast with the drama and with the power that only Al Jazeera within the Arab world could bring. So there was a bit of there was a complicity in it. It was a loop. And I think there's always a debate, particularly in North America and parts of Europe, about citizen journalists and how do you kind of use the power of so many people. Well, in this case, I mean, journalists always rely on observers. There aren't enough of us to witness every event that happens. So what we do is we rely on observers and eyewitnesses. And I think in this case, what we were able to do is we're able to kind of encourage people to give us their tweets, their video, and we're able to broadcast it. So it was a loop, and it created a kind of a power and an impact in a very compressed period of time that really, I think, helped to make this such an incredibly important part of modern Middle Eastern history.
Well, you know, one thing, I mean, the amount of content, of photos, of videos that has just been generated during this time has just been staggering. Was that highly unusual? Was that the first time that Al Jazeera saw so much content from ordinary people?
Yes, and I think all of these. I mean, there have been various situations. I remember the bombing in London created a whole kind of impact on British networks. Clearly, there have been situations here in the United States where all of a sudden networks have been inundated with material. I think that probably the difference with the Arab awakening was that there was a political thread that tied it through. There was clearly, as we look back, there was a profound popular uprising against a series of authoritarian regimes which were somewhat, in my view, a bit like the old Soviet Union. We're really destined to fall. It took us a while to realize that moment was coming. And we were able, as an organization in Doha and elsewhere, and we're able to kind of sift through it. And by broadcasting and amplifying and reporting what we were getting, with verification as much as we could, there was a full picture, a full portrait that was being drawn that in hindsight proved to be accurate. I think that's always the risk of these things. But I think that this was not a kind of an eyewitness account of a isolated event. This was a political process, a revolution that was going on, and I think that we could not have delivered the totality of our coverage without the willing contributions of literally thousands of people throughout the Arab world.
Thank you. And Charlie, so you've lived and covered the Middle East for many, many years, and you were actually there in Cairo during the recent rebellion. What was it like being there in Tahrir Square on the night that Mubarak fell? And we have an audio clip that your team recorded that night. So why don't you set that up for us?
It was in my 25 years of reporting, it is the most exciting story I've ever covered. In my 20 years of covering the Middle East, it was the most unpredictable story, but it was also the one that had, I think, the most potential for real change. I just had never covered a story like that before. So personally, it was very exciting to be there. I felt very much inside that loop. We were on the street, and the loop was surrounding us with, this just turned off, didn't it? Did it just turn off?
Why don't you take this?
Sure. Oh, well, now it just went back on. I'm in the loop. Now I'm out of the loop. I better take that. Okay, now someone like messing with me up there, or is this? I think that to set up the audio, what I really was hoping to do here was to say I partnered, our Global Post partnered with Frontline to do a documentary that would really try to capture the drama of those days of the revolution, 18 days that led to the fall of Mubarak. But one of the moments that I loved the most turned out not to be good video, but it turned out to be amazing, I think, audio, because it captured a scene that was one of the most riveting or memorable for me. And that was the night that Mubarak had stepped down. There were about 7 or 8 members of the Revolutionary Youth Council who we had been following the whole time. The guy who we really fixated on was Mohammed Abbas, who was a Muslim Brotherhood youth leader. And our task was to really look at what role did the Brotherhood play in this. Eventually, he became a star on Al Jazeera in Arabic. And we watched his transformation over these 18 days from a sort of a street, a poor working class kid to a leader, to someone speaking to the Arab world in Al Jazeera. Very interesting. But in that night, that last night, about 4 o'clock in the morning, fireworks are bursting, the crowd is on the street, and the cameraman and I decided to circle back and just see one last time what Mohammed Abbas had to say. And we found him inside a tent with 7 other members of the Revolutionary Youth Council. And they were drafting what felt very much like the kind of communique that might have come out of Philadelphia in 1776. It was called The Birth Certificate of a New Egypt. And even though this was a digital revolution, it was written by hand on the back of a torn piece of cardboard torn off a water box. No one had any paper. These youth who put this together were from, they were from the El Baradei camp, they were from the April 6th movement, they were from the Muslim Brotherhood, they were a Coptic Christian woman, really representing all the different walks of life that had come together in Tahrir Square. And we watched them as, it turned out, the Muslim Brotherhood guy was the only one with a pen. Someone else had just torn the cardboard, and they had crafted sentence by sentence together, secular and religious, men and women, all of them young, this statement, which you can hear in this audio clip.
A new Egypt. The people have finally toppled the regime. The people have finally toppled the regime. With this spontaneous chant, the Egyptian people declared the revolution of the 25th of January. With all pride, we announce we are on the brink of the new Egypt we have always dreamt of. An Egypt free of fear, oppression, tyranny. An Egypt of safety, transparency, and tolerance. This is a great awakening, and the Egyptian people will no longer allow a tyrant or a corrupt to lead.
It ends with the sentence of, this is the birth certificate of a new Egypt. And it really, beautiful statement. I think it's a little bit long to run. That's a Coptic Christian woman named Sally who's reading that. And what I thought was powerful in that moment was the way in which the people who were part of the digital part of this revolution, who were on Facebook, who were the admin for the various blogs that were covering this, or those who were tweeting messages to get people out on the street, had combined with the Muslim Brotherhood, who came out on the street for real in big numbers, large numbers. And it was this combination of forces that was digital and very human, that was online and very much on the ground. And that was what I took away from my 18 days in Tahrir Square, was that I felt like that loop that was happening was also a sort of loop within Tahrir Square that was simultaneously digital and very human.
Thank you, Charlie. Okay. Susanna, so movements.org has been around for a couple of years now and has been training human rights activists in digital tools and training activists to train other activists. First, why don't you tell us a little bit about how movements.org got started, a little bit about the April 6th Youth Movement Facebook page?
Sure. So yeah, we sort of noticed a few years ago that it was becoming a lot easier to use new media and new technologies to get a lot of people together in one place, whether it's on Facebook or wherever else. But then, there's a question of what comes afterwards. And a question of if these people who end up with these large followings online have the capacity to be able to keep those movements going afterwards. So what we thought would be perhaps helpful, and what I think we've seen borne out in the past few years, we've seen this happen organically outside of what we do and as well as within our organization, is that activists, people who are longtime activists as well as people who are newly activated, are learning from one another, are sharing best practices with one another, and are helping one another to build up their capacity after their initial protest events or whatever it might be. So we brought together in 2008 people from different movements around the world. So somebody from the April 6th movement in Egypt, somebody from a movement called No Mas FARC in Colombia, to talk about what they had been able to do with technology and what their strategy might be going forward. And we saw this process of activists learning from one another, I think, really happen in the Middle East this year. We saw it happen between countries and even between time periods. So between the April 6th movement in 2008 versus in 2011, I think really learned a lot in terms of taking the action offline from online. And that was a process of these activists figuring out, this isn't working, but what would work? In a similar way between Tunisia and Egypt, people are sharing information with each other that are really specific, how to avoid tear gas on the street, how to build up as many people as you can without getting arrested immediately. So that process is something that we're just trying to bring scale to the global level.
So I'd like to do is, if we, you could tell us a little bit about Alive in Libya and of the women's demonstration. Set that up for us, because we'd like to share a clip.
Okay, yeah. So this is by somebody who's kind of at the top of our network, who goes places and trains people to be trainers. So he gives people information about how to basically create. We have tons of people everywhere creating media, right? But a lot of the time, their media that they're creating would be a lot more effective and a lot more impactful if they were trained a little bit more. So he goes places and just gives people basic advice on how to use video to create short, impactful videos. So he actually just got back from Libya, where he met all these young Libyans who just, as soon as he met them, said, "Help us make better video. We want to do this." So that's what they've been doing since, and you can go and look at any of those videos if you'd like at alive.in/Libya, and there's also one for Egypt, /Egypt. And so I think this is a woman who is, I haven't seen the clip, but.
Well, let's take a look at the clip.
يوم السبت اللي صار يوم السبت قوات القذافي تقصفنا، بس شكرا للتحالف الأجنبي هو اللي نصرنا على القذافي، ونحن مظاهرة هذه ونحمد ربي على اللي صار، وإن الحمد لله ونحن صامدين، ما زلنا صامدين، ويا إما نموت يا إما النصر يا إما الاستشهاد، وإن مع معمر مهما يدير ليبيا لنا نحن وبلادنا نحن، ومهما يصير هو اللي حيطلع برا ونحن حنقعد، هذه بلادنا ومش حنطلعوا منها أبدا.
Thank you. Let me put this question to Susanna and also to Nadine. I mean, we've all been talking about the very important role that social media has played for activists in terms of getting the word out, building a highly engaged community around very important issues, being an outlet, the online cafe where the permanent emergency law in Egypt, did not allow people to gather and have these discussions. But at the same time, these very powerful tools present risks for activists. And I know, Susanna, that's part of your training, and I was wondering if you could just share with us some of the concerns, that you share with activists. And Nadine, maybe you can tell us a little bit, too, about what your experience is.
Yeah, I'd love to hear Nadine's perspective as somebody who's there right now, because I think what we look at a lot is that security is really important. As activists learn from one another, so too do dictators, and they're getting better and better at watching what people are doing online, and in some cases even interfering. So the first thing really is awareness, being aware that you're not really, you should be skeptical about when you're using Facebook for online organizing. And so we've been doing a lot of work trying to sort of get the message out that there are certain things that you can do if you're using Facebook in a place like well, really anywhere, for activism, for political change, that sort of thing, to be safer. You can't ever be completely safe, but you can be safer. I would love to hear from Nadine about sort of what the level of awareness is in Egypt right now with regard to staying safe online, and if people feel like that's still necessary.
It's interesting because right now it's kind of a murky situation. Everyone's been outed. Most of the activists are very well known. But I'd like to go back to earlier. The Khaled Said page, we logged in as ourselves and initially started organizing, as us, hoping or expecting the admins to remain secret. And Wa'il Hunaim, who was the initial admin, warned me and said, you should start a secondary admin. And this created a secondary identity, a cipher of sorts, where he was engaging entirely under this El Shahid identity. And it was a Google account. I knew who he was from the beginning, but most activists on the ground would talk to him in real life and not realize that he's the admin of Khaled Said. So he literally led this two-part life. And this came in sort of crystallized in clarity when we started getting threats after the flash mobs. And they weren't directed directly at us. They didn't know who we were, but it was a little frightening, but we sort of expected that Facebook would protect us. And then around November, the presidential elections, I was focusing on my work in the U.S. I was living in the U.S. at that point, and I was focusing on my work there. And then I get an email saying, "Oh my God, they took down the page," and quickly got a hold of Facebook because as a communications director in the U.S., I had those sort of contacts. We quickly got a hold of Facebook. We asked them what was going on. They said the fake identity on Facebook was against their policies, and they had closed those fake identities, and therefore the page naturally shut down. So our mechanism was, since I hold an American passport and I was living in the States, I became the firewall. So they added me as the admin, and everyone would sort of log in through me. This protected the identity of the activists on the ground. And until January 25th, I don't think anyone knew who Khaled Said. There are, I'm sure, some activists here who he had told. There was more than one admin to the page. There were different people who knew certain things, but you couldn't tell who it was because they were literally logging through my account. One of the interesting
and it was dangerous, right? At that point, for anyone to know who the admin of that page was.
We were getting death threats. They were searching for them. They were. I don't know this firsthand, but I was told stories of them arresting people, thinking that they were the admin. This wasn't a joke. I had gotten to the point where I would go into meetings where we were organizing around the Dr. Baradei campaign and then democracy in Egypt. And I would tell everyone, take out your batteries out of your phone. It had gotten to a level where I was scared in the US, but if people were willing to put their lives on the line in Egypt, I, of course, was willing to do it wherever I was. It was a real threat. But there are ways around it. And one of the things that I really want to sort of highlight is that Facebook as a company was not really aware of what they had. Facebook as a tool was brilliant, but Facebook as a company, while they did try to engage, their policies were not necessarily conducive for this kind of activism. You have to be a real identity, which allows you to be hacked. Tunis had a lot of hacking. Facebook had a lot of Egypt, out of Egypt, there was a lot of hacking and what I call Mobots or Mubarak robots hacking the page or trying to post. So Facebook as a space, as an innovation, is amazing. There is a little bit of work for some of these social network companies that do this to understand what they really have in the terms of digital democracy.
And also there's a big question about whether they want that role. And
I don't think they have a choice in the matter to complete this. I mean, you're putting people's lives at risks right now. So when you're given that choice, and this was what I was telling Facebook, was that there's someone's life at risk. We're not talking about your bottom line. We're talking about a life. And sometimes was when they would talk about the bottom line, I'd say there are 100 activists that could die if this thing gets out. So when put in those stark terms, I think they have to face up to the facts that they've created innovation that is an amazing tool for democracy. And digital democracy isn't just online. It has real life implications, and this is one of them.
And of course, Wael Ghonim, who was the admin of that page, was arrested shortly after the January 25th protest.
I found out recently that they didn't know who they had until they had him. They were arresting him because he was in a coffee shop with someone they were following.
Oh,
so we had done
That's so interesting.
Of hiding his identity, but once he was caught, we were all at risk.
Interesting, fascinating. Charlie.
I was just going to say that sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
I was just going to say, you know, this revolution is dangerous business. And it's dangerous business for those who are the activists online, who are risking their lives to stand up to this tyranny. It was dangerous business back in 1776 when the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, and there was 6 years before that, at least, there was the Boston Massacre. There was people standing up in I would say Boston is closer to the Tahrir Square of America than Philadelphia, because that's where the stand was made,
Watch
where
it,
the
Charlie.
confrontation
You're in
happened.
Philadelphia.
All right, I won't get into the Red Sox or anything like that. No, I really think this is really serious business. I mean, Al Jazeera correspondents have been putting their lives on the line to capture these moments. Our correspondent put his life on the line. A young guy, John Jensen, who's our correspondent in Cairo, is sort of a classic example of what is a global post correspondent. And we have 70 correspondents in 50 countries. They all have different profiles, but his is probably the most common. He's in his late 20s. He speaks the language. He speaks Arabic. He went to American University of Cairo. He's American, but he is of that place. He's living there, and we want our correspondents to live in the place they write about. He happens to live right on Tahrir Square. So this happened outside his balcony. But the risk that people are taking to document this, both those who are doing it through blogs and through admin and through organizing, or journalists who are covering it, is really something to ponder tonight. And I want to, without getting too heavy, I do want to say we have a correspondent who's been detained in Libya. And he was detained 7 days ago, and we still have not been able to have contact with him. Al Jazeera's had correspondents detained in Libya, and I believe you still have some who are detained. These are issues that we have to keep out there in the fore. The journalists are risking their lives to document this. Our correspondent is James Foley. He's, again, one of these late 20s. Actually, he's in his early 30s. But he is someone who is really out there on the front lines trying to bring this home. And he was detained by Libyan government forces, and we're working very hard to secure his release. So I just want to mention his name, if I may.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that is just abundantly clear, just closely following all of this, is like here in the National Constitution Center, you can just like walk through this like amazing exhibit on the First Amendment and on the freedom of speech. And not everyone has freedom of speech. And it's just freedom of expression, freedom to assemble. And I think just like for all of us here, just covering it and it's just amazing just what has been achieved and what is at risk, and the really just courage of so many individuals across the Middle East and North Africa. You know, for your correspondence, I remember I was looking at Twitter, and there it was in real time. Your correspondents were live tweeting that there were secret police, right inside their hotel room, taking them away, confiscating their cameras, their notebooks, their recorders, their computers, and taking them away. And of course, later they believed that the fact that they were able to share, what was happening in real time using Twitter, and broadcasting that to the world, helped them eventually get released.
There's an incredible relationship between Al Jazeera, obviously Al Jazeera Arabic, and people in the Middle East that goes back to its creation of the service in 1996. Because I think there is, it kind of dominates, the channel dominates this region in ways that really is quite unusual. We're all in America, elsewhere, there's a lot of competition and there's often no dominant leader. But I think particularly, the issue is trust, and there's a kind of a feeling on the part of a lot of Arabs during this period that there's a trust that they can expect out of Al Jazeera. But the tensions, the conditions under which the journalists, Al Jazeera journalists, have operated, not only within Tunisia, within Egypt, within Yemen, Libya. We have 3 journalists who are still in custody. One of our cameramen was killed in a premeditated, targeted killing. It wasn't an accident. It was the Gaddafi forces. The Gaddafi forces that knew where he was and targeted him. And I think any Al Jazeera person now, certainly in Libya and formerly, and I think in some of the other countries, really felt under siege. And I think it's something that, that is, it becomes part of the norm with Al Jazeera, but I think it is a kind of a reminder. And that's why I think a lot of the bravery and courage of these activists it's so marvelous, because it is inspirational, I think, to a lot of journalists who kind of realize. I look back now at this period, I think as many of us will and do, as just an incredibly uplifting, positive period. And through most of it, I viewed it from North America, although I was in Doha very briefly during it, but mainly from North America. And I found the evolution of American coverage interesting, is that there still was that kind of, beneath the surface, that fear that there's something going on that ultimately will rise and harm American self-interest somehow. Is it the Muslim Brotherhood growing in Egypt, or is it somebody taking over the government in Tunisia, Yemen, the whole issue of Al-Qaeda? And I think obviously any intelligent observer of the world has got to be kind of sophisticated in terms of the various forces that are at play. But I think at the end of the day, I think what came to an end, or what is now in the process of ending, which is a horrible series of tyrannies that led to the impoverishment and hopelessness of so many millions of people. Part of that flowed, and I say this with gentleness, flowed out of Western self-interest. Like, why was Mubarak in power for 40 years? Because it was perceived by Western powers, including the US, well, it was in the American self-interest. Well, at the end of the day, it wasn't. These propping up these regimes are not in the American self-interest any more than they're in the self-interest of other Western countries. And I think that was the message that was coming from the streets of Tunisia, coming from Tahrir Square. And I think that what I'm sensing as I watch the American media, as they try to make sense of what's going on, and they realize that the Nadines of the world and others are really the majority. And I think that we're going to, if we could fast forward 5 years, 10 years from now, I think we'll look back and realize that this was not only an incredibly important moment in world history, certainly Middle Eastern history, but also was a very hopeful and positive one after decades of dark experiences.
Charlie, and we'd love to invite your questions. So if you could please come to the microphone, members of the audience.
Really quickly with one comment.
Yes, please, Nadine.
Yes, there's the question of the Muslim Brotherhood. While they were important in a lot of the organizing on the ground and outside of Facebook did not just rely on the Brotherhood. Activists had been working with the Kafaya movement from before 2005, from 2004, to engage this. There is a long history of this. So democratic, social democratic movement had built, and then there was sort of a momentum that built with Dr. Baradei coming in, with a lot of non-activists joining the momentum. And so it was a bit of a tipping point. The Brotherhood did not engage early on in the protest. So this fear of the Brotherhood you see early on in the protest, it really wasn't the Brotherhood that brought these masses into the streets. Yes, they can bring 1 million people, but the tipping point doesn't occur because of the Brotherhood. They join in when it's secure, when they know that it's almost a done deal. So I think the political movements felt on the ground is really, I mean, the Brotherhood youth are part of this coalition, and they shift together. But it really is a youth being mid-30s, I have to say, but a youth
Sounds youthful to me.
that really is not just on the ground, isn't just the Brotherhood.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I followed the Brotherhood very closely in Tahrir Square. They did come late, but they came with big numbers.
Yeah.
And once they came, they were a big part of the momentum. But their role has been distorted, I think, a lot in the Western media. And I think we tried in Frontline and at Global Post in this partnership to really get at how this happened. And I think the documentary, because we had a full hour, gave us an opportunity to unpack that in a way that I hope, Nadine, if you haven't seen it, if you do see it, I'd hope you'd think that it was pretty accurate. But I wanted to just build on the idea that what does this mean? How has the American public viewed these incredible events unfolding across the region? And I think one of the things that interests me is where is our State Department on defining how it's going to respond to these events? I don't pretend to know the right way to respond, because I think it's very complex and it's country by country. And I think there's a set of realities that need to unfold. But I do sense that there is not a lot of attention being paid to a moment in Egypt, in particular, to seize the future, to recognize that whether they're Muslim Brotherhood or they're El Baradei or they're April 6th, it doesn't matter. What matters is they're between the ages of 20 and 30. They represent the preponderance of the region in that age bracket. And they have very little to look forward to economically and politically. If you think about the perspective of Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 to bin Laden in Al-Qaeda. So Zawahiri is Egyptian. For about 30 years, he has been practicing and preaching terrorism to try to topple Mubarak. In 18 days of largely nonviolent demonstrations, they took him down. I mean, that's like putting that retardant foam that you use in fires on tarmacs out over Al-Qaeda if you seize the moment and you encourage the kind of organizing and the kind of nonviolent movement that's happened. But if American people and those of us in the media get caught up in the fear of that moment, or don't paint an accurate picture, if we don't do the hard reporting to really bring it home, I fear that moment could be lost.
Well, let's take a question here from the audience, and then let's return to that, because while Tahrir Square may have been the equivalent of the Tea Party and Boston Massacre in Boston, the Constitution was written right here in Philadelphia, just a block or so away, and that is the real challenge. And a question is, what role will social media and will Al Jazeera play in that very important next step? But first, let's please take a question from the audience. Hi, if you could just introduce yourself, please.
Yes, hello, my name is Gamal. My question first to Nadine, and I would love to hear from Paul and Charlie. My question for Nadine, actually it's two of them. What do you think about the claim that you guys were, the youth revolution was driven by inertia, to the extent that you guys didn't listen to the final speech from President Mubarak? My second thing, my question again, what do you guys think of the claim that the youth movement was driven by inertia, to the extent that you guys didn't bother listening to the final speech for President Mubarak? The second question, still for Nadine, what do you guys say about the fact that if Gamal Mubarak in a democratically free election will actually still win the presidency? I would love to hear from Paul and Charlie as well.
Whose poll are you relying on for that?
The Egyptian poll, sir.
I haven't seen him in any Egyptian polls. I mean, now you have Amr Musa, Bastawisi, I mean, Al-Barad'i, you have, I haven't seen him in any polls. And I don't think he even is able to run for president because of his dual nationality, if I'm correct. The inertia, I'm not quite sure what you mean by inertia, but I think that the inertia in itself implies that they didn't take action. And I think the general sense in Tahrir is, even today, is we want to take action. There's a sort of balance between being strategic and being overactive and sort of exhausting the country from this sort of revolutionary, radical protest mode. But same thing you have right now with the military. You have the military sort of moving at a snail's pace and only reacting to when we bring 1 million people out into the streets. So it's sort of an interesting perspective because you see that it's the politics of protest. When we come out in large numbers, our demands are met. So if that's what you mean by inertia, yes, the Mubarak speech and the military's lack of movement has sort of fueled this continued protests and the sort of continued action on the part of the protesters and the revolutionaries.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And what about what's next, and what role will social media play in what's next? I mean, one thing, Susanna, that you and I have chatted about is that just one of the wonderful things about the web and organizing online is that it's horizontal. But in many ways, that creates a challenge. Or my question is, does that create a vacuum?
Yeah, I think that's a huge challenge, and what we're seeing right now in Egypt is that people are, you have political parties and campaigns like the one that Nadine is helping to run, and then you have questions like on the part of other people of, do we create a political party or do we remain in civil society? What do we do with our social movement? What do we do with the people that we've activated in these past 18 days or 7 years? How are we going to continue to keep the original goal of our social movement alive and to push on the political parties so that the goals of the revolution continue to be pushed for, and we're holding people accountable. And I don't know what's going to happen there. I worry that there's going to be everybody is going to shift towards just creating and getting involved in political parties, sort of leaving behind civil society organizations, which is incredibly important. To your point about people using technology, I think that if you have a new vision, a new goal, a new theory of change, then the things that worked before the revolution, having a horizontal network, using participatory tools like Facebook, can work after. And we've seen that a little bit with Wild Gonim creating a Google moderator page just to sort of ask people what their most important policy prescriptions are. That's a minority of the population that's using that, but it's still an interesting tactic, an interesting idea that I hope that we see more of.
I'd like to point out that some of the larger movements are grappling with the question of whether to become a party or not. But one of the interesting things that you see is you have small groups forming on and offline, creating closed Facebook groups. A friend of mine joined a group that's looking to rebuild and has reached out to the ministry. I mean, this is an influential group who are looking to rebuild Tahrir, looking to rebuild Egypt. There's political awareness organizations that are forming, police accountability organizations that are forming. These are all on offline. I end up in meetings where I find out this group found each other on Facebook and decided to meet in a small advocacy organization in Cairo. So while these aren't necessarily coming through the international scene, because they're kind of closed and open, but also because the larger groups sort of get all the attention. But I think it's important to note that Egyptians form in communities. We naturally found this, and they I came here thinking this wasn't happening and was pleasantly surprised to find hundreds of groups forming and coming together and taking action. And these are productive steps moving forward, it's a very vibrant scene here. And they function on and offline simultaneously.
And that's exactly what a couple of presidential candidates are hoping social tools will do for them in 2012. So why don't we go to Charlie, and then I think we have a question or two from Twitter. We asked folks to send in their questions, use the hashtag digital democracy.
Much rather have the question, but just very quickly, I would say that I think one of the things that I heard very early on, just days after Mubarak had stepped down, was a fear that exactly this would happen, that you would have fronts develop, not parties, and that it would splinter, and that the momentum of the revolution, of the collective experience of Tahrir Square, would be lost in the fracturing of different small parties or fronts. And that then the military would actually stay in control, potentially through Amr Moussa or through some more establishment figure. And that is the moment. That's where we see what happens. This is the really interesting few months leading into this election. And it's just fascinating to watch.
Thank you. And we have a question from Twitter.
Yes, so the first question from our online viewers comes from another Charles, coincidentally, and he asks, it's a two-part question, will the effect of unrestricted communication impact the constitutions of Tunisia or Egypt, and are they concerned with the issue of net neutrality?
Net neutrality? I don't think they're concerned about net neutrality in Tunisia. But
okay, well, I think one interesting thing about the sort of relationship between people in Tunisia versus Egypt and the internet is that in Tunisia there was everybody was accustomed to having to use circumvention strategies and tools to get to the internet itself, because the Tunisian government was really adept at making everything they wanted to be blocked. So I think it's interesting how that sort of affects people's behavior, how that changes the way they behave as activists. It was completely different in Egypt, where the government there really was not adept at filtering the internet, so that everything was widely available. And you can make probably plenty of suppositions about the degree to which that would affect the constitution formation process in either country, or however much it affected the revolution itself in either country. But it's definitely it's an interesting interaction to look at, absolutely.
Another really key turning point moment was when Egypt, the regime, turned off, they tried to shut down the internet.
Absolutely.
And that, I thought, was so interesting, because that had the net effect of then pushing people into the street. Young people who were following this online suddenly realized they can't get online anymore, so let's go to Tahrir Square.
They also couldn't get up with phones or anything like that, so they had nothing else to do but to go out and see what's happening in the streets.
So there's a wonderful sense of this momentum, once it started, cannot be stopped.
And it's important to note that internet access in Libya it's very, 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 very tough to get internet access. So the role of social inside Libya has not played a major role. In Bahrain, it played a huge role, as did the cameras inside cell phones. And when activists there in the middle of the night were removed by the government and by riot police, for many of them, the only weapon that they had was the camera in their cell phone. And they photographed what was happening. They sent those photos around the world. So when dawn arrived and the government had tried to make it look like the camp had just vanished and everything was cleaned up, photos and video had already moved all around the world, telling quite a different story. But again, like getting back, Syria. So Syria had blocked Facebook. And earlier this year, they allowed people to use Facebook. And one of the big questions, of course, at that time was, would that be a good thing for users and for activism, or was that just an opportunity for the government to actually see who is out there? Nadine, you're shaking your head.
Well, it's interesting because I think Facebook sort of, the allowing Facebook into Syria is one of those things of what not to do or what a regime should not do. Mubarak did, from my perspective, or the Egyptian regime, did everything wrong, and then everyone sort of learned from that to do everything wrong. And then Syria, which is a kind of a joke between some of the activists here, Syria allowed Facebook, and we all turn to each other and say, didn't they learn from the first couple of revolutions? It's interesting because one of the Syrian Facebook admins is actually in here in Cairo and was meeting with some of the activists here. And there is this really close network of people that sort of know each other. I think that the Syrian regime really hoped that it could follow, but you can't really follow a tool that you don't understand. If you don't understand the language and they're talking or interacting in a way that seems very alien to you, I don't think that these regimes really know what they have or what they're looking at. I actually don't think the US actually knew what it was looking at when the Egyptian revolution happened. So activists are very adept. They shift really quickly when there's a block. It's very innovative. These people are used to functioning under very restrictive regimes and switching tactics quite quickly. So it's interesting. I don't think you could stop this once it starts.
Do we have other questions? Yes.
Yes, so we have another question from Karen. She asks, she wants to know how the quote-unquote digital divide is going to impact social media where democratic movements are taking root.
Excellent question. Who wants to take that?
I'll make a quick point.
Go ahead.
I think it's important to look at the difference between the internet access and mobile phone access. In Libya, for example, you have about 6% internet access. It's over 100 mobile phone access. Oftentimes, mobile penetration skips internet access, so that countries aren't going to get a lot of broadband ability, but they're going to have a lot of mobile phone penetration. And we're seeing people use mobile phones for activism, for connectivity, which is democratic in a way and helps foster these movements in a way that's successful.
Yeah, there are different ways you can, it's a dark, the whole idea of the media, according to Walter Lippmann, is it's a darkened room, and where do you put your spotlight? Where do you turn it on? And I think those of you, those of us, I guess, who have been involved in work in social media, Facebook, it leads to the question, was this a Facebook revolution, a Twitter revolution, et cetera? And I think most of us realize that no, it was an Egyptian revolution, a Tunisian revolution. I think that it would probably, in my view, it's premature to overrate the impact and the power of social media in all of these stories. In that, I think what you had is you had a revolution, and you had, thanks partly to social media, partly to established channels like Al Jazeera, in other words, traditional media, television appearing in the homes of people throughout the Arab world, is you had a lot of information being shared about what's happening not only in other countries, but also within their own country that's really, truly unprecedented in the Arab world. Somebody made the comment that, when the French Revolution happened, immediately after it, nothing happened immediately, because the nature of the society at that point was that news of the French Revolution was put on a ship, and it took many weeks to, the news to get to Haiti, and then a similar revolution happened within Haiti. But here you had a situation of where, when the fire in Tunisia sets alight, it immediately, because of not only, let's be careful here, of Twitter and Facebook and the internet, but of the power of just the whole technology of television and broadcasting, as you had people instantly aware of what was going on. So I think at the end of the day, let's face it, television is a tool, Facebook is a tool, so is Twitter. They are not, in a sense, the story. What happened there was that in a society, and I'm talking now about much of the Arab world, and I obviously defer to those of you in the room and, dare I say, on Skype who are more informed about this, but I've done a lot of work in the Middle East. I lived there for 3 years until recently, and it was, to a great extent, particularly in certain countries, it was a closed society. It probably was, as, you know, it was. I covered the fall of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. It was as closed as those societies were well before the Berlin Wall fell. And all of a sudden you had this, the fact that the walls were falling, the fact that the sky was falling, became instantly known within the country, within the region, and I think that kind of, that it was so inspirational. I think the fact that television or Twitter or Facebook was an instrument that allowed that to happen in a far more, in a far faster way than obviously it happened in the period of the French Revolution, I think is a given, you know, but I think it's something that just, I think it underscores not only the potential of this technology as it evolves, but also just the power of information. And when all of a sudden you bring information to closed societies, you know, God help you, you know, things will start happening, and things, in my view, thankfully started happening there.
Which brings us back to Nadine.
Yeah, I think one of the important things when you're talking about the digital divide is this revolution did not happen because of the people who've ever touched a keyboard. It's important to remember that it's the people who have never, it's the organizers connected to each other through Facebook, through social media. The people watched it online, but it was the people who went into the streets, into the areas where they've never seen a keyboard. They really were not paying attention. They were doing real on-the-ground organizing. They were going into poor neighborhoods, making noise, talking about this, getting people, I mean, this is what happened on the 25th, was they had a plan to go into poor neighborhoods where people may not even have TV. They were gonna go back and forth between the streets, and then call people, engage people in the conversation, and then drive them to Tahrir. It was what connected all these nodes of different ideologies and different people was Facebook. But what got the 30,000 was not Facebook. I think it's important to remember that at the end of it, it takes real hard work on the ground, grassroots organizing to get this out. It isn't the Facebook generation it's the Facebook generation that connected, but it wasn't them that made this revolution.
Thank you. We have a question here from the audience. Well said, Nadine.
Yes, just real quick. I'm sure all of you are probably familiar with. I'm sure you're familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's piece about the revolution will not be tweeted. I'm curious to see what your take is on that, on his take now, in light of all of this. There's the part I do agree with him is about the impersonal nature of online group forming. And he references this specifically in regards to wealthy Westerners. And so I'd like to see what the panelists think about the divide between what Americans say American youths use these social media tools for compared to the rest of the world, or rather what is not accomplished in this country.
So with the question one about Malcolm Gladwell and who would like to take that? I guess that many people would like to hear what he has to say after what has just unfolded.
Sure.
Would anybody want to jump in to that conversation, and then we'll get the second part of your question?
The opposite of the Malcolm Gladwell is Leclae Shirky, and I don't think either of them are right or either of them are wrong. I think it is the melding of the social media. It's when it becomes a natural part of our daily lives. Seeing activists on the ground, they don't differentiate. They're always on Twitter. They're always tweeting. So it is partly tweeted, but it's not just on Twitter. They're on the streets. They're walking around. They're having conversations and tweeting, and then responding to conversations on the ground with other tweets. So they'll ask a question. I happened to go into Amn al-Dawla, which is the National Security Service, when I first came here. The way we got there, the way we found out how to get in, the way we found out where it was, what is the secret door, what we had to say, was all on Twitter. This was a public conversation. But it wasn't actually just on Twitter. I mean, these were people walking in the streets, we were running into them afterwards. So it isn't really tweeted, but it is kind of tweeted.
And I think Tony said it best when he said, these are tools. These are tools. But at the end of the day, you need people to use the tools. And then the second part of your question?
Regarding the divide between what we see in this country and the use of social media, which seems to be entertainment,
Farmville?
Entertainment, satisfying narcissism, etc.
I have 4 boys, and they're texting all the time. They're using social. They have their own social network. Sorry, can you hear me? Or it seems to go in and out. But I think you put your finger on something really important, which is that America, at least young people in America, haven't used these tools in a way to accomplish much. They're very powerful tools. And if they are applied toward affecting change, they will affect change. But in places where there is despair, like there is in the Arab world, for people who are between the ages of 18 and 25, this is all they have. They aren't playing, COD. They're not sort of networking to gossip about each other. This is all they have to get their shot at real change, which they want more than anything else. If we reach a point in America where there's a desire for change, I think those tools will be unleashed. I just think we're sort of like a fat and happy country that doesn't yet need those tools to affect the change it wants.
Well, one, it is important to note that these tools have been very powerful for good and for all sorts of wonderful charitable organizations. And there's been a lot of innovation. Chris Hughes, one of the Facebook co-founders, just started Jumo, which is this incredible platform for good, and movements.org, I think, is one of the organizations on there, so that people can not only just give money, but get information. And again, part of my role at the New York Times is going to be watching how the presidential candidates use social media in the upcoming 2012. And Republicans caught up with Democrats in the midterm elections. So it's going to be fascinating to see how President Obama, who demonstrated in 2008, his campaign staff, they had figured out that web thing and it worked very effectively, and Republicans took notice. So I think that we're going to see some interesting new uses of social media and politics in the next year and a half.
All right, thank you.
It's important to note that you're talking about 2 different spaces. In the U.S., having lived there for many years, I can go into a public space and say what I want. In a lot of these oppressive regimes, Facebook and social media is the only space. So if I can go out and talk to people and engage them in a different way, I will use that. It's the easier, it's the path of least resistance. But if social media is the only space for you to do that, that's why you will do it. I don't think it's necessarily that Egyptian youth are, a lot of the Facebook generation, the people who are engaging our Facebook, are very affluent. There isn't this sense of despair. A lot of them can afford computers, are living somewhat comfortable lives. I think it's the fact that the space itself, the public sphere, is required for anyone, and the sense of the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to come together and do all that. When that's oppressed, you will find it somewhere else. It sort of bubbles. It's like a balloon, a water balloon. You squeeze it one place, it comes somewhere else. In the U.S., we're not squeezed. We can say what we want in a public space. Media is free. They don't shut down Al Jazeera for no apparent reason. Media actually there's.
Well, wait a second. Actually, they do.
They don't open.
Oh, sorry, Al Jazeera. I have to say, I watch you online. I don't have a TV. When I was there, you were my favorite channel. So I have access to you at all times. But I'm saying there's a more free society. So
but
that was my sort of overall point.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on that, I think that it's interesting. I was thinking on the question in that there is a certain irony that here, and I don't restrict it to the U.S., I think it's Canada as well, you have this proliferation of social media tools that actually is often used for arguably trivial or narcissistic or, irrelevant reasons, except just distraction. Whereas in this Arab awakening, where the tools are far less common, and let's face it, and I mean, I think I'm accurate in saying this, I'm not being partisan, that most Arabs learned about the Arab awakening through watching it on television on Al Jazeera. Much of Al Jazeera's coverage was a reflection of the input through tweets and through videos, and like there was an incredible partnership that developed between the journalistic kind of gatekeepers at Al Jazeera and our reporting staff, which started at maybe 20 people in Tunisia, maybe 40 people in Egypt. By the end of it was in the hundreds and if not thousands, thanks to the incredible popular contributions of people. But still, the reality is that the social media tools in the Arab world in the last 6 months to this day have been used for such fundamental universal values like free expression, democracy, lack of opportunity, these things. And it is, I think that, although I live, in this country and know it very well, I am a Canadian living in the United States. And so to a certain extent, I'm in the helicopter somewhat higher than many of you. And I think there are a lot of incredibly important, urgent issues that need to be resolved here. And it will be interesting if particularly young people, but not only young people, start directing the incredible proliferation of new media tools here in America to start dealing with them, And again, your biggest impediment, our biggest impediment, because I think this applies to Canada, are the commercial broadcasters who see no value anymore in a serious, and I'm talking about NBC, CBS, ABC, who see no value because it doesn't add to the bottom line in a serious coverage of the world beyond the borders of America.
And many of us here have been lucky to have Andy Carvin from NPR. If you're a Twitter user, you must follow Andy Carvin on NPR. And he has been just doing an amazing job curating the tweets coming out of the Middle East in North Africa. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us here tonight, and especially Nadine, who is, I would say, Skype is pretty awesome. Yeah. And I'd just like to thank Drexel University and Temple University and the National Constitution Center, where you can see some of those tools, those pamphlet things that were used here in Philadelphia and in Boston during another time when democracy was the talk of the town. So thank you all for coming, and please let's keep the conversation going on the Facebook page and on Twitter. Thank you.
Programming on DUTV is made possible by the Cal and Lucille Rudman Institute for Entertainment Studies and the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design.